Hello and welcome to another episode of Reclaim Today. I'm Jim Groom and I have the pleasure of being joined here today by Livia Foldes and Riv Ellen Prell. Livia and Riv Ellen, feel free to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a professor emerita, meaning a retired professor from the University of Minnesota, where I spent my academic career. I was in the Department of American Studies as an anthropologist with academic scholarly research interests in American Jewish culture, politics of the 19th through 21st century.
Hi, I'm Livia Foldes. I'm an artist and designer. The way I talk about my practice is that I work in the latent space between art, design, technology, and activism. So I'm often looking towards the future about different possible futures, and that also often brings me into the past, as with the site.
Yeah, it's pretty compelling in that I found the site so Reclaim Today is an offshoot of Reclaim Hosting, where the site we're going to talk about today, A Campus Divided, is hosted. And there was a recent issue with PHP, which is definitely not the focus of this talk, which brought to light the fact that a site, A Campus Divided, was throwing errors. And so we had to resolve it. And when I went to the site, I was really struck by the visual design, which kind of brought me in, and the title, which talked about a campus divided. And I had this idea that I was going to be looking at a very contemporary moment at which, we were looking at current university campuses being divided. I even read something that said there was a political movement called America First. And so I was like, wait a second. And then come to turn out, it's this, discussion of racism, anti-Semitism at the University of Minnesota during the 30s and 40s, as well as anti-communism. And I couldn't help but be deeply intrigued. So I asked both of you to come and talk a little bit about the site, because that's the extent of my knowledge, but I really want to know how it started, the research behind it, and how the site lives on as a kind of a reflection of that moment and maybe ours.
So I'll begin, as I was the originator, co-curator, and curator of the website. I became interested in this topic reading a very small and somewhat obscure article about anti-Semitism in the state of Minnesota in the governor's election in 1938, which was the first time anti-Semitism really entered into the political arena in Minnesota, largely because Minnesota still has a rather small Jewish population, very dominated by German and German immigrants, by an elite manufacturing class that had originally come from the Northeast. And Minnesota was the site of one of the most important progressive movements in the United States in the 1930s, alongside the state of Wisconsin, the neighbor of Minnesota. And that group was called the Farmer Labor Party. And just the alliance between farmers and laborers was almost unheard of in the United States. And that relationship brought to power a few people running for the governor from Minneapolis, who had around them a number of young Jewish men and women who came into politics with them, particularly with Governor Floyd Olson. So that anti-Semitic moment was the subject of an article. And as part of that, it was a discussion about what was going on at the University of Minnesota, where the Dean of Student Affairs, a man named Edward Nicholson, was not only spying on students for the FBI, but was also closely linked to a Republican operative who was the person behind this very anti-Semitic campaign. So those papers about that story were held at the Minnesota Historical Society, and an advanced graduate student named Sarah Atwood, who I hired to work on this project with me, suggested that we needed to start paying attention to what was happening in the archives of the campus as well. And there we found, simultaneous with what we were looking at, was a movement to keep African American students, of which there were small numbers, even smaller than Jewish students, out of taxpayer-funded housing on the campus. So in 1931, the very first young African American man to come from Washington, D.C., to try to live in the very first men's dormitory was immediately asked to leave because they did not want to have integrated housing in a public university in what was considered a progressive state. And the president of the university, Lotus Kaufman, was very much behind that. So what unfolded for us was the beginning of a story about student activism, about racism and anti-Semitism on the campus. And what's especially interesting is, though there were very active student movements in Europe in the 19th century and the early 20th century, in Asia, the very first student movement that really developed in the United States did not happen until the 1930s and became a major force in political life in the 30s. And so we had a story to tell about students exactly the same ages as the students who were at the University of Minnesota in the 21st century, who not only changed the politics of the campus, but were engaged in global politics. So that the first student movement in the United States was a movement devoted to global politics. And that was the student protests at the end of World War I, when millions and millions of young people were killed, initially opposing any engagement in Europe. That's the background. It took about a year of research before we mounted what's called a physical exhibition. And the additional thing that I would add is this happens exactly at the moment when American campuses are dealing with memorialization. Who do we honor? Whose names belong on buildings? Who should have a statue on a campus? Brown University was the very first university that acknowledged the centrality of slavery to the building of Brown University, which launched a movement that is very much with us now. And public universities were, let alone in the Midwest, seemed to be very much less engaged in issues of slavery, but we found the same issues. Who do we honor? Whose names are on our buildings? What story is told and what story is invisible? This physical exhibition opened 1 week after Charlottesville, Virginia, when Nazis marched on the campus. And then President Trump explained that they were very fine people alongside others. And I believe that part of the great success of this exhibition, which was the largest to this date that has ever happened at the University of Minnesota, in part was inspired by students, citizens, faculty being horrified to learn that there were other very problematic people whose names were on our buildings as well.
Now, part of reading the site, and we'll talk about the site here shortly, because it is, very well done and a lot of different elements, but to hear about the physical exhibit that I think took place in 2017,
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And how long, just two questions, I'm sorry, how long did the research you did, how long was the journey from you to finding that one or writing that one article to getting to doing a full-blown physical exhibit that was extremely popular on campus? The context is everything. It's beautiful.
Context is everything. So I didn't write the article that I found. I found the article and it sent me into the archives. It was a little bit more than a year. I retired a year earlier than I had planned to be able to work on it full time. And I had a number of graduate students who worked with me. I had faculty who served as my advisors. But here's what everybody said, and that's very relevant to your site, Jim. And that is, everyone said, you have to write a book about this. This is remarkable because physical exhibitions last for a few months. They extended it because it was so popular, but it was a 5-month exhibition. But to write a book, which could have been interesting, did not seem as important as doing a work of public history that could be widely available. And that is why that people, including Livia Foldes, who knew about the exhibition and who I had spoken to, suggested that we needed a website, because what a website would do would be two different things. It would not only have, sad to say for academic books, a wider audience, but it would keep growing. And that is why public history is so essential to be done through the web. And this exhibition that we've done has changed and changed. It's added documents. A year ago, I completely rewrote this section of it on the segregated housing story because I found more documents, because in the years that followed, I came to understand things much more deeply, much more complexly about the relationship between the campus and the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, but also national movements. This website is so much more dynamic. And of course, had I written a book in 2018, it probably would not have included some of the other things that I created. So the existence of a website has given it, like so many works of public history in higher education, about slavery, about anti-Semitism and racism, could not have been as dynamic if we didn't have a website. And then that issue of the website, especially for a total rookie like me, was how do I find a partner who's going to help me figure out how to translate it, how to make it visually interesting? So many websites in public history, I guess I'm just going to put it out there, are often so visually uninteresting. And what Livia Foldes brought to the project, which so many people have commented on, colleagues, experts in history, but also in visual design, didn't look the way most of them look. This site is, I think it's worth saying, beautiful. And that is not how most of those sites look. So the beauty of the site was brought by a person who had a great sense of visual design, but also a great interest in how to present the history. And maybe that's a good segue for you, Livia Foldes, to sort of talk about the problems that you saw, because they happened simultaneously. The exhibition opened on the campus in August of 2017, and the site launched in September of 2017. So it was a huge effort all around, between the museum space that we were using, which is in a building that houses archives, the launch of a website, and then people coming into the building and our trying to help them understand the significance of what they were seeing and how to understand it.
How did that planning go in terms of saying, we know we want a website, we know we want it to coincide, or at least as close as possible, with the opening of the exhibit? How was that translation, and how did your relationship come to be? That's a great question, and thanks for the segue.
So, Livia, do you want to talk about what it was like to watch the physical exhibition opening and the issues that you had in creating the website?
Yeah, I mean, the exhibit design and planning were done relatively separate from the web side of it. So they were kind of unfolding in tandem. Of course, with Brevellen, you know, having the vision for both of them. And I think that's something that a really unique and interesting challenge for the design of the site was exactly about providing context and about making it feel contemporary and relevant, which it absolutely was, while also having the visual part of it be these like largely really old documents that wouldn't necessarily read on their own. Like you really need to understand the context to be like, oh my God, this letter is the smoking gun. And so, yeah, I took that on as the challenge. And I, of course, worked closely with the site's developer, Jared Smith. But I think like the first decision was to use really bold, intense colors and kind of disorienting crops of some of this archival imagery to really highlight that urgency and relevance. And I think the other big guiding question was like, how do we provide the context that people need to understand how important these documents are? And so what we landed on was what I think of a structure of like dense linkages. And the site, actually, would you mind pulling up the site? It's probably easier to talk about with a visual aid. Hey, there it is. So yeah, you can definitely see, the disorienting crops, the bright colors already. And if you wouldn't mind navigating to, if you scroll down a little bit, sorry, this is going to be a bit clumsy. And then where it says menu on the upper right. So when we launched, the two main buckets were that we had essays. So these documents were illustrating a broader narrative written by Revellin, of course, and then the documents themselves, which exist as an archive that people can use for research and to cite within their own research. And so the question for me was like, how do we get people fluidly in between those two, in between the narratives, where you're learning the context and all of the ways it relates to the broader issues, and then kind of zooming in close on the documents. So if you could, will you click one of the images that are up right now, the like communist or cat's paws? Oop, go back one. Okay, yeah, so if you click on that, and this is the case for any document across the site, there's of course a little bit of context, but then there are two prompts. There's read the essay, which is the narrative flow, and view details. And so for each one, they kind of kick you into like a different flow in the site, but then in each case, there are many links to cross back and forth between them. And then, yeah, would you go to view details? So this is kind of the archive portion, the non-narrative essay portion of the site. And so of course you can like get in close, use this for your own research. But we also felt really strongly about tagging everything by subject as a way to really reinforce the themes of the archive itself. So for any document that you're on, there's also tags of related subjects. And so you could say there's so many entries into this for what your research may be. So let's learn more about political surveillance on college campuses. Like if you click that, we can then move through the archive completely by looking at all of the people, documents, letters, and so on that are related to the subject. And then if you wouldn't mind taking a look at, go back to the menu. This is like user testing in real time. Yeah, maybe we could just like look at one of the, read the essay, and we can see it in the other context that it's in within this narrative flow. And so in this case, there are these, and Revellin, please feel free to jump in about the writing of these essays themselves, but they link together the writing, and then the documents are interspersed throughout to kind of serve as, it'd be great if you could scroll a little bit, to serve as illustrations, proof of these points. So yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. No, but I was going to mention, like, even as I was looking through the archive before jumping on this call, I was interested in how kind of striking a lot of the propaganda kind of imagery was on both sides, and like to see the go for communist. And I like that the site itself, when you first go to it, is with that red and blue that's alternating. Like you said, it's a super bold, like, this is an important topic that needs to be paid attention to, kind of like a lot of the imagery that's built within the site. I don't know if that was part of the design, but it was striking to me right away. And it's why I dug deeper into the site, was that kind of emergency call in to investigate.
So we appreciate that. We're very glad for you as a user that you saw it in that way. One of the great challenges that we had was that we didn't have a lot of images. So Go for Communist was found in the papers of an anti-communist who was communicating with the FBI. Many of the things that we found were in that were very helpful to us were being tracked by one of the biggest anti-communists actively cooperating with Christian nationalists in the 1930s in Minnesota, which was one not a major center, but a small center. So why did we have a challenge about finding images? Because what we learned is we were trying to tell a story about Jewish students and African American students, and the yearbooks of the University of Minnesota are digitized, and there are no photographs of Black student organizations. There are no photographs of Jewish student organizations. There are a few kind of, graduation pictures if the student chose to have his or her picture taken. But if you want to understand what it meant to feel invisible as a student, if you were African American or Jewish in the 1930s, look at a yearbook in the Midwest and see why your pictures aren't in there, your stories aren't in there. And so how did we find some of these images? Well, we used the Black press and the Jewish press because there were community presses that were very active in the Twin Cities in particular, but in Minnesota. So we would learn about student activists in community press and then have to go back to archives to try to figure out who these people were on the campus. It was, of course, a frustrating and disturbing thing to know, but it was incredibly exciting to uncover the lives of those students in their own communities, while the university that's supposed to be liberal and progressive and says they will admit anybody because it's a public university being invisible. So we found out about discrimination in housing against African American students, in the archives, in file folders that said either Negro or Jewish, which is where they existed as a problem. But if we wanted to learn about their activism, the differences they made, who they were, couldn't look at traditional sources, had to find them elsewhere. And so I'm not a historian by training, but the general view is historians like detective fiction, because there was a lot of detective work that was hard, especially if you have to look at, as Livia was explaining, very old documents that did not show up well. And she had to enhance and make as readable as possible. But it was exciting to tell an invisible story. And that's why it spoke so deeply to so many people, both on campus and off campus, about these stories that they would say people didn't know. But if you talk to older African Americans, they knew these stories. They knew about housing. They knew about discrimination, but otherwise it was largely invisible.
It also brought into that public archive alternative sources than the University of Minnesota, right? So you would have this idea of this kind of, triangulation of resources that told a more, I would say, fleshed out history of that time at that place. Was there, given that when I read on the site, I didn't write anything on the site, I promise, but when I read on the site that, this was a kind of uncovering of a history of the University of Minnesota that a lot of people weren't very familiar with or aware of, was there any reaction to it? Like, were there folks in the administrations like, do we really want to highlight this? Or was it like, what, this is the time? Just out of curiosity.
No, it's a great question. Before I answer you, Jim, I just want to quickly say that I began working on this when Donald Trump was running for the presidency. And the America First movement, or America for Americans, came out of the 1920s as an anti-immigration movement that was specifically focused on stopping immigration from Asia and from Southern and Eastern Europe. And Southern and Eastern Europe meant Italians and Jews. Italians and Jews were not forbidden to come to this country ever publicly, though there were people in Congress who wanted to. But if you could just limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, you'd pretty much taken care of the problem. And so here we were working in historic sources as Donald Trump's campaign draws on every one of these images. Now, he's not running primarily as an anti-communist, which is what would have been happening in the 20s and 30s, but he's running on race and racism. He's running on identifying groups as others. He's using that very helpful word dog whistle to evoke racism and anti-Semitism in his work. And so you were right to read this and think, deja vu. These are the same groups, the same names, using the same issues. And so it became very compelling to try to bring this story into the political moment that we were finding ourselves at exactly the same time. So I'll tell you briefly the ongoing afterlife of this exhibition, because it created a student movement. And the student movement, parallel to many campuses in the United States, was to take off the buildings the names of the university president, the dean of student affairs, the vice president of the university, who the documents made clear were absolutely behind keeping dormitories at the University of Minnesota segregated by race. There was sufficient pressure from that student activism in 1931 and then 1935, then 1936 with the founding of the Negro Student Organization, to stay at trying to force the university to allow integration. And the university kept denying that they were committed to segregation. They just weren't willing to allow African American students to move into the dorms. But as the Board of Regents and the president kept saying, this isn't a policy. Just for now, we don't want to allow African American students into the dormitories. And one of the university presidents changed that policy, and then it was changed back again. And so the students were very aware of who the people were behind it. And they did a brilliant job of building alliances with across African American and Jewish student groups, progressive student groups, in the community, circulating an online petition that received thousands of signatures to rename the buildings. They passed this in the student organization. They brought it to the president. The president appointed one committee, academic life being what it is. Then they appointed a second committee. And that second committee was made up of a very small group of faculty and students who looked into the charges about the 4 buildings they wanted to rename. The ability to rename any building on the campus, or for that matter, name, rests with the Board of Regents. Public universities don't have trustees, they have Board of Regents. They are appointed by the state legislature. That was true in 1930. It's true today. And the regents are always a mix of conservative and more progressive parts of Minnesota. And when these materials, about 2 years later after the exhibition, were presented to the Board of Regents, I was in the audience. I was not a member of that task force. What I saw from those regents was unlike, frankly, anything I had ever seen at the history of the University of Minnesota. They accused these outstanding scholars of memory and history, experts in African American history. They accused them of lying. They lied because I was very familiar with the documents that they were talking about. They lied about what they said and who was responsible. And the Board of Regents do not have to ever allow anyone to speak at their meetings. And no one was allowed to speak, to respond to them, to say that they were wrong. There were editorials in every newspaper in the state of Minnesota. There were campaigns on every side. And there were 3 regents in particular who were not telling the truth, who were directly lying. And at the final meeting, when they voted not to change any building names, but to continue research, one of those regents said, I want read into the record that maybe there were problems with housing, but there were no other ways that African American students were discriminated on that campus. One of my most important advisors was Professor John Wright, who was retiring 3 weeks later. He is a distinguished scholar of African American life, and he is a fourth generation Minneapolis African American whose father, whose aunt, whose grandfather had gone to the University of Minnesota. And a shout went up from those of us in the audience demanding that John Wright be allowed to speak in response to that statement. They initially called the campus police to take us out of the room. At that point, I was a grandmother, a retired University of Minnesota employee of some distinction, and the campus police came in to remove us until cooler heads prevailed and John Wright told the story of his family and what it was like. So the drama of this situation being covered by the local newspapers, it had a lively life actually on other forms of chat and whatever. And just this September, the university finally announced the policy that will allow any building older than 70 years or older to have a name removed. So it took 5 years from that initial exhibition to the university and its regents finally acknowledging that this needed to be a process to come to terms with what was done. So I'm happy to say one of those regents retired. The second was not reappointed after a massive effort. And I'm happy to tell you the third is coming up for reappointment. And these resources will be brought again to hold him accountable for what he did. So a long answer, but a pretty compelling story built in student activism. And I believe that the students were inspired by what they saw the students do in ending campus racism, in student housing, and changing other kinds of policies.
I mean, there's so many amazing threads in this one website and this one story. The Regents meeting maybe being the culmination, but you're starting off talking about, the 1930s, and this was the era of Sinclair Lewis. It can't happen here, and a lot of that rhetoric, and to put that alongside stuff like the first student movement that was both local and global in its kind of conception is a really fascinating moment to understand how that parallels to, the late, 2010s, where we have a lot happening in Minneapolis, right? It's not limited to the campus, right? Like it became a global phenomenon with the police brutality there, right? Which was it really like resonates deeply. And I'm sure that resonated deeply on campus too, around like all of these things contribute to, finally maybe banding together as a student or thinking of universities as once again points of resistance. So
absolutely
fascinating stuff.
So Jim, I especially appreciate you bringing up the horrific and traumatic events of George Floyd's murder, as a way of thinking about public history. I can't explain this to you, but I was absolutely amazed to learn, because I have analytics, that the most difficult night of the resistance to George Floyd's murder, when the cities were full of violence, of police violence, of what people now know as many outside agitators coming to also create violence, other people trying to get control of the cities and keep it at the issues that they were trying to bring to the fore. I was amazed to see that very night, 700 people went on the site. I have no idea what brought them there. I don't know what they were looking for, what they were Googling that brought them to a campus divided. But that night and subsequent days, there were nearly 1,000 people who came to the site. And what a statement about the nature of public history, that people want to understand what's happening. They're looking at a city they probably know next to nothing about. They're interested in what racism might look like. And they went to the site to try to learn more about it. And I know that they were looking at issues about racism on campus. I know that they were looking at discrimination in housing. And so not only are these issues very timely, but people are deeply interested in public history to have some reflection on it and make sense of it, and to go back to the 30s and look at what we who lived in the Twin Cities and live here were especially tuned into, is the terrible continuities between racism in the 30s, through the 50s, through the 60s, and into the 21st century. And so these sites have a story to tell and to help us make sense of it.
I'm not very good at unmuting myself, better at muting myself because I want to hear you talk. And I do want to say this, that one of the things that's interesting you also mentioned is this idea of it's an ongoing text, right? Whereas the book 2018 published, right, there it is. This is one now, as things develop, as they have, it becomes a resource that can, again, not only live on and be accessible for free, but also be something that's built upon based on things happen post facto, or you learn, or different resources, because the archive, I imagine, is still giving both on the university and beyond. So that's a fascinating way to think of these websites as their own dynamic space that are building and then designing. Because I just noticed when we put the gopher up and the red behind, like, there's a statement in every element of that website that is beautiful. But that terrible continuity you're talking about is like, I'd struggle even with the gorgeous design of it. It's quite interesting. So,
And there's
I'll be
another
quiet.
design element to it as well, because we added a whole other dimension. Because Livia brought to us the fact that there could be very interesting ways to interact with documents. And if you want to go back to the menu, though I think you have to go. So Livia, is it on the menu or is it only on the landing page where we can get access? Livia, you're muted.
Oops. Either one, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's a big link to it.
There it is.
Yeah, a deep dive into documents about power.
So that happened. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, this happened a couple of years after we began the website, and it had to do with design issues that Livia brought to me and thought could be very interesting, which is an active engagement between a close reading of a document and then understanding it. This in part was also political, as we were told that various university administrators couldn't possibly be held responsible for the things that happened on the campus. There was constant shifting of blame. Oh no, this was the regents. Oh no, the regents didn't create this. The president created. Oh, the vice president wasn't responsible. It was the president. And with that shifting of blame and denial of what we were trying to get out there about the university in the 30s, Livia came up with this design. And I did the sort of writing part, but without the technology for it, I wouldn't have known about this. And so she really took the lead in design about giving me the idea that then we worked on together about how to create this interactive approach to power that involved, as you can see if you scroll down, kind of close readings of these documents. And I've come to be familiar with this because the New York Times uses this so much, but I hadn't known about it before. And I was really grateful that Livia had introduced me to it.
Yeah, it's kind of a scroll-based interactive narrative. And this is like, it's kind of embarrassing, but honestly, my hope for this was just to make sense of who all of the people were and what their relationships were to each other, because I found it really difficult to follow. Like, it's just very complex. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of like specific university positions and hierarchies, and Ravelin, being an incredible historian, is amazing at keeping all of these like relationships in her head. And I was just like, wait, who is the regent's guy again? Like, what was his relationship to this person? But I realized that it actually was also an opportunity to, again, if you're a historian, this stuff is all really familiar to you because it's what you do. But I'm like, the rest of us don't know about this. Like, the rest of us are not used to this level of scholarship and this like kind of, detective, like close reading through documents. And I was like, can we make that clear for people that are outside of this field? So it's just like, okay, here's a letter, here are the people involved. Like, how does a historian actually look at this? And how do you get from this documents in the archive to understanding like what the story actually is and what happened? And so, yeah, as you're showing right now, it's scroll-based, and we set up a framework where users could scroll to highlight key passages from a document. And then, kind of almost like footnotes or something, like show like what it is about each of these statements, like what's being said and what's not being said, that then helps Ravelin or other historians put together the story.
This is gorgeous. I was going to comment on how the header, they look like, they're mugshots. Like, if you go back up to the top, there are these mugshots in this deep, gorgeous red that you use brilliantly throughout the site. But this is next level in terms of the interactive, like, contextualization of passages and a historian's commentary to help you read through these relations. I did not get this deep into the site. This is absolutely brilliant.
And I should add, this was developed by a different developer, Andrew Lux. It's very much a collaboration.
Wow. I really like it. This is, I can see, like, I just love the way they pop out. I'm doing this and you can kind of see it the way they pop out. And then, as you go through them, it's quite clear that this is the commentary talking about what happens in this sentence. It's almost like close reading in literature. Exactly. To try and make sense of this kind of, wow, very impressive.
So just as an example, I'm not going to make you scroll back up, but okay, go back up, and there's this letter from the university, right there. Go back to the yellow letter.
You got it.
And at the very bottom of the letter, we note that President Kaufman, who's explaining why Black and white students should not live together, stop right there. He writes, this is to the NAACP, the head of the NAACP, the first Black woman lawyer in Minnesota. The relationship which we have had between the races in this institution has been wholesome. So wholesome is a eugenicist word. So this is the era of eugenics, this idea that your inferiority based on race might control whether you reproduce, and hence was leading to tying the tubes of Black women throughout the South and elsewhere. But in its somewhat, if you can say that, milder form, it's about a racial hierarchy. It's about who deserves to reproduce, who deserves to be valued. The fact that Lotus Kaufman uses the word wholesome lets you know, if you are on the inside, that he's a social eugenicist, and that the reason he does not want Black and white students to live together as men in a dormitory is because he says you can be in our classrooms, but you absolutely cannot have social relationships with each other. That's a tiny little example of what the word wholesome absolutely means in 1931. And so that was kind of the great thing that Livia made possible as a designer, that you just can't put into an essay. You mention it in passing, nobody's going to even notice unless they're reading it carefully. And so that's why I was so grateful for this wonderful idea that she and Andrew Lux were able to put together for the project.
And even the power of seeing the typewritten letter, right? Just like with the communist pause, like there's
Yes.
real power in that document and that artifact.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, because the general view of what everyone said to us was, who is going to care about documents? You think that you are going to get people on a campus the size of the University of Minnesota, which I would like to mention has the Mississippi River running up the middle of it, to walk all the way to the farthest end of what is called the West Bank. And they're going to stand around and look at documents like that. And guess what? They did. People came from off campus. Thousands and thousands of people came to stand in front of these old yellow documents to just read stuff like this that wasn't supposed to be possible in a place that was viewed as so politically progressive, that in the 19th century, in principle, gave rights to African Americans, though not in practice, that were fairly unusual. And a place to which both Black and Jewish families were so grateful that their students could go and get an education, unlike with the quota system in private schools in the Northeast. And yet they couldn't even live in a dormitory if they were coming from a small town in Minnesota or from elsewhere. And one of the things that we uncovered that was the beginning of the exhibit, because we thought it was extremely helpful, is that we discovered that the university administrators were carefully counting out-of-state Jewish and Black students because their anxiety was so high about putting them in dormitories. And it wasn't enough just to count how many Jewish students were coming. They were counting how many Jewish students were coming from New York. Because, of course, in the 1920s and 30s, people just assumed that every New York Jew was a communist. Again, this anti-communist, anti-Semitic, not anti-Jewish religion, but Jews being viewed racially as political aliens. There it was, right in President Kaufman's files. Tell us how many Jews are coming from New York, because we can't stop them, but we have to make sure what we're going to do to keep them out of our dorms or out of our boarding houses, or ways to contain them. So these dusty old documents that nobody had looked at for a really long time have now they're digitized because they're so fragile, and so many people wanted to go into the archives and look at them, that they rapidly digitized everything, or they were going to either stop people from looking at them, which is the first thing they tried, or they had to protect them.
Well, I think it speaks also to a larger piece that I imagine both of you are very much aware of, that you've been working on, is it kind of recenters the artifacts that kind of constitute the context of a particular truth and reality happening at a time that like has been everything but, like there's been no, under the presidency of Trump, that idea has kind of almost been unhinged. And like maybe the document and these artifacts brings us back to a kind of physical materiality of these were the processes by which decisions were made and people were behind, and there needs to be accountability. And that's a really something at the beginning of this call I hadn't even linked to the magnitude of the work you both have done with this project. I really think it is amazing.
You know, before Trump was stealing things from the archive, the very first thing you began to know, when it was hard to imagine what his presidency would be like, was that he wouldn't allow the archive to show photographs from his inauguration. He immediately began to try to control what could be in the archive and what could not. And that was in the first months. So thank you, Jim. You put that so eloquently. Yes, that was the first play. And this was clearly not a man who spent a lot of time reading history books or going to archives, but he got where the records were. And he immediately tried first to take control and then just to take them. So
I didn't even make that connection with the archives and
with those photographs from his inauguration.
Yeah. Wow. So I just want to say to both of you, thank you very much for taking the time with us today to share this unbelievably powerful website, but also the unbelievable context behind it, the story, the people, filling in the gaps. The, like you said, I think it's such a great statement, the unfortunate resemblance to our own moment in some ways. So thank you, Livia. Thank you, Rivelin, for joining us today on Reclaim Today and talking about this amazing project, but also giving us a history lesson, which I think is the power of the site as well.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it was wonderful to hear your own insights and impressions about the site as well. It was like,
Absolutely.
oh, great, that's how it's coming across. Like, that's what we had hoped. And you're, bringing your own connections.
You really facilitated. There are very few people who are interested in this who get the design piece and the content piece. Really, this was a very rare and important moment, especially for me, because that kind of double perspective that you brought is pretty unusual. So thank you.
Well, the embedded magic of, like, I go on, Olivia, about the design that brings one in, and then you have the story, and on the other side, like, you're in now. Let me hit you with this and that and this. And that's how websites should work. That's the very idea of that kind of, and maybe propaganda is the wrong word, but you do need an aesthetic to push a movement forward and to understand that this stuff has to be compelling in a way to understand. And you both have nailed that in really powerful ways. So again, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.